All right, good morning, and thanks for all coming. It's lovely to see so many people who are interested in a specialism of mine, which I've been engaged in over the past dozen or so years. And it's all looking rosy again, thank goodness, to the World Cup and the football and this wonderful display of open, welcome tolerance that Russia is suddenly showing once again. So all must be forgiven. Misunderstandings, which have been misunderstandings, can be put to rest, and we can even see the wonderful alliance of Theresa May and George Osborne looking forward to a great celebration of football in Russia. But joking aside, what I'd like to do with this talk here is to think about the perception of the British establishment and the British media regarding Russia to begin with, followed by an analysis of what is actually happening in Russia, the systems of power which have been created under Putin, and the potential for any opposition towards those. And then, as a kind of final bit, how do all of those three things, how does the perception of the British establishment, the actual systems of power that exist in Russia, and the potential for opposition, how are they used and how can they be used to inform a position for the British left regarding Putin and regarding Russia? So starting with the position of the British establishment. The British establishment has been very much egged on into adopting a confrontational position against Russia in recent times, and this was particularly marked by the Novichok incident in Salisbury in March this year, which Theresa May seemingly was very eager to leap upon in order to demonstrate a hard line regarding Russia, but also to drum up support, for her failing government. It was actually the incident occurred on the same day that the pre-budget report was being released, and of course that meant more austerity, more curtailing of public spending and public services for the British public. So the Novichok incident actually provided Theresa May's government with quite a good day to bury some bad news. And of course, the right-wing media in this country started to whip itself up into a kind of frenzy regarding the scandal of what had happened, that a former Russian spy and his daughter had been poisoned on the streets of Britain. At no point subsequently, actually, very up until this week, where there has been a second incident of people being poisoned by the Novichok nerve agent. At no point within this entire process has there been any conclusive evidence which has been brought forwards that demonstrates that the Russian government is necessarily behind that. Now, that doesn't mean that the Russian government isn't behind it. It doesn't mean that another one of the players in Russia, in the Russian power structures, isn't behind it and is using it to their own ends. It simply means that we don't have the evidence, we don't know, therefore it would be dangerous to make the assumption, and by making the assumption, Theresa May has actually put her government into a position of conflict and confrontation with Russia, which is simply being used to support her government at a time of turmoil. And of course, this attitude has been actually influencing the attitudes of the so-called mainstream or liberal media in the United Kingdom. Moving away from the kind of very populist Daily Mail headlines, we've got people like Luke Harding for The Guardian, who is known for his anti-Russia stance and his anti-Putin stance, to be coming out with a whole range of articles condemning Russia for its seemingly failure to play by the rules of international norms and so on and so forth. But even leaving people like Luke Harding aside, it was very interesting. Last week or so, there was a Channel 4 interview with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov by Kathy Newman, which was an absolute horror show. I don't know if anybody saw this, but Kathy Newman, who I thought was quite a respected journalist within the mainstream journalistic establishment, had rings run around her by Sergei Lavrov because she put forward a thesis that says that Russia is, very much an aggressive state, is very much. She was putting forward ideas very much regarding Russia as being a very aggressive state, as Russia being, somewhere where human rights and these kinds of norms, which are established in the West, are not adhered to by the Russians, and actually done herself more, I would say, disservice to her journalistic integrity, as Lavrov was able to challenge her quite rationally, challenging her seemingly hysterical claims towards Russia. Now this position that the Russian bear is back, and that the Russian bear is back, that it's growing in terms of its international stature, it's breaking international norms and conventions through, for example, annexing Crimea, through introducing anti-LGBT legislation, for its crackdown on protests and stuff like this. Takes no account of the real realities in Russia, and does nothing to really strengthen the position of any opposition groups who are really trapped in Russia by the Putin regime. The whole Novichok incident and the UK's belligerent stance towards Russia developed in the week before the Russian presidential elections, where Vladimir Putin was returned with a record 80% of voter turnout in favour of his regime. And of course, what the belligerent stance of the British establishment enabled the Russian media and the Russian state to do was say, look, again, we are being targeted, by the hostile West. They are developing a hostile ring around us regarding NATO. They wish to see us subjected to the international global new world order, whereas we want to remain independent from it. And if you want to remain independent from it, vote for Putin. Now, Putin himself, I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about Putin himself and the power structures that exist in Russia. And of course, the system in Russia is based on two notions. The power system in Russia is based on two notions. The first of which is the power vertical, and the second of which is managed democracy. And I'll come on to talk about these a little bit. But first, just want to kind of talk about some context, because these notions of the power vertical and of managed democracy have grown out of the historical context of the 1990s, where Russia was reduced to a kind of Hobbesian state of nature, as it were. Yeltsin, Putin's predecessor, was very much. Yeltsin was very much informed by a position of extreme libertarianism. He wished to decentralize the Russian state as much as possible, giving as much power to the regions as in his words, they could swallow. We will stuff them full of autonomy until it comes out of them again, I believe was his quote. And of course, this also this reduction of this increase in Russian autonomy for the regions was coupled by a massive privatization program, which put forward, which basically sold off the major assets of the Russian state to those who were in a position to take advantage of it. Those who had, links to international finance, international banking, those who had already well-established businesses by the early 1990s, and of course by various criminal groups who were able to impose themselves on this newfound freedom and this newfound libertarianism. And in the 1990s, power in Russia was really wielded by those who had the capacity to use violence. And this was, by what I mean by that, I mean those who were able to use violence. What I mean by that is those groups who were able to establish businesses and draw on the potential to increase their share of the market by going towards hiring the services of various power wielders. There's this very often misconceived view of the Russian mafia. The Russian mafia is, somewhat, yes, it is a kind of dark underground world and so on and so forth, particularly in the 1990s. But very much very much towards the end of the 1990s, the Russian mafia were actually able to increase their holdings in the share of Russian businesses which had been sold by the Russian state, and really enforce themselves on the political situation as an independent actor capable of maintaining their own political power base. And of course, what they also done, running alongside this was the growth of the oligarchs. Those were the people like, who have we got? Famous oligarchs: Roman Abramovich. Sorry, you'll have to excuse me. I've been quite ill last night, so kind of losing my flow somewhat. People like Roman Abramovich, people like Boris Berezovsky, Guzinski, who was a media magnate in the 1990s, so on and so forth. And these groups were actually able to use their economic power to start wielding force over Yeltsin. And of course, we saw this through things like Boris Berezovsky being awarded the contract for state television, TV1 in Russia in the late 1990s. He was able to use his influence over President Yeltsin in order to gain such prized assets. Stepping in 2000, Putin effectively reset the clock to a kind of 0 point. The state was brought back into control, and Putin used a number of methods to curtail the growing power of independent forces within Russian politics. The first victim of this, and very well known one, was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who in 2003 he was funding opposition parties. And I say opposition parties in the sense of mainstream opposition parties. The Communist Party, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which is neither liberal nor democratic, but hey, and forces like A Just Russia and other parties like that. He was Russia's richest man at the time. He had a huge fortune. His estimated net worth was billions by Forbes magazine. And in running opposition candidates against Putin, he found himself very much in confrontation with the new power system which Putin was attempting to build. Putin wasn't interested in building an independent civil society. He was very much interested in building a system which he had control, right from the centre. He was the centrifugal force within Russian politics, Russian economy, and Russian society. Khodorkovsky was arrested on tax evasion charges. I mean, this was ridiculous because if you go to Russia, who pays their taxes? Nobody really does. It's actually, when I was living in Russia, I found it more difficult to pay my taxes than to not pay my taxes. So by arresting and putting Khodorkovsky into jail, I think he served eventually about 9 years. He was released on the eve of the Sochi Olympics in 2012, and he made an imminent dash for the exit. He moved to, I believe, Switzerland first. Now I believe he lives in California. So that was very much the first victim of Putin's power vertical, bringing Russian politics and economy back into state control. Subsequently, we've seen the ministries, the judiciary, the regions, other local authorities and businesses are subject to directives from the centre, not the other way round. In 2006, Putin abolished gubernatorial elections. Those are like federal elections for state governors. And subsequently, they have been appointed by the state. The one exception to this is the mayor of Moscow. So if you see Moscow elections happening, that's the one area, one local region in which local elections do take place. Putin restricted the activity of non-governmental organisations through laws in both 2006 and 2014 to operate freely in Russia. Civil society organisations must register with the Interior Ministry in order to carry out operations in Russia. And, you know, just as an example, Greenpeace, for example, you know, a nice cuddly Greenpeace, they were denied registration, I think for a period of about a decade. It was only in 2014, 2015, I believe, that they were able to operate again. In 2008, Putin carried through a series of judicial reforms, which were, to quote, designed to create greater transparency and bring the courts into the line with the regime. And of course, you know, what has happened through this reform is that the Russian court system has very much been brought in line and subject to the directives of either A, the state, B, the local governors and the local regions, which is effectively an arm of the state, or C, vested powerful interests within those organisations. So if, for example, you have maybe, a dispute about ownership of a company, the person who in this dispute is better connected within the official system of Russia is much more able to gain a favourable outcome, is able to influence the court behind closed doors and through unofficial channels than the person who does not have access to this. So again, this power vertical is literally thinking about Putin at the top, putting layers of power down below him to make sure that that his directives and his will runs through that vertical like a centrifugal force, like a spine, as it were. And also, some of the other things with the anti-protest laws of 2012 onwards, which limited unsanctioned protests to one person. And sanctioned protests to heavy police presence. So what this means is that unlike in some other countries in the world, if you want to have a protest, you must officially write to the police. They can give you or deny you registration for that protest, as police forces in many other countries in the world operate. But if you do get a protest, it is likely to have heavy police presence surrounding it. If you are having an unsanctioned protest, you have to be one person standing on their own, maybe with your placard, maybe with the information literature which you wish to distribute on your own. The nearest person to you would be maybe, I think it's 100 meters, they work on metric in Russia, 100 meters away. So you can imagine, going down one of the, large streets in Moscow like Tverskaya, people dotted along having an unsanctioned protest and the potential for intimidation and all the rest of it which would come from that. Now, of course, running alongside this, we have the idea of managed democracy, which is the domination of Putin's United Russia party in national and local elections from around the time of 2004 onwards. And what happens here is that United Russia are promoted heavily through state-owned media outlets and with the help of state resources. Putin doesn't need to campaign in elections effectively. He just gets lots of television time. If you put on Channel 1, Channel 2, NTV in Russia, you will see, in the run-up to the election, oh, Putin was at, a factory in Ural region today, meeting workers and listening to their concerns. Whereas the other candidates are put onto, what I don't think it could be described in any other way than an absolute shit show. You had 5 candidates in the last presidential election taking place in a debate. A female candidate, which was a kind of rarity in Russian politics, Ksenia Sobchak, I'll talk about her in a minute or two, being derided by the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party as a whore. Consistently, to the point where she got so frustrated that she had to throw water over him in order to shut him up, which only, actually put more flames to his fire. But the perception of the population watching this is that none of these clowns can be taken seriously, so I'm going to go with, one like Putin, to make a reference to the 2008 pop song, which was number 1 in Russia for that time. And of course, so it's very, very difficult to make any kind of electoral breakthrough for other parties. And I've realised at the time, so I'm going to skip a little bit here and start talking. Oh, just a word about the media as well, that the way that the media operates. Of course, the media, while in the 1990s it was very much financed by private capital and there was relative freedom of expression within the media, it has now turned back to being majority state-owned or majority state-owned organisations, which developed this cultivation of the Putin cult, which developed the cultivation of the Putin cult, and provide a kind of reliance of great Russian nationalism. Channel 1, which is kind of their version of BBC, is the weirdest channel you could probably ever watch. It's like Fox News on steroids. I remember watching it in the wake of the Boris Nemtsov murder. Boris Nemtsov was a liberal opposition politician who in 2015 was murdered yards from the Kremlin, and he was due to release a report on the state of human rights in in Ukraine during this time when the conflict in Ukraine was at quite a high point. He was the regime clearly didn't want that to happen. He was murdered. The state took over all of his laptops, hard drives, etc., and they haven't seen the light of day since. But watching the Nemtsov murder coverage on Channel 1 was the absolute most bizarre Orwellian experience. Was it, a disgruntled lover? Was it a Chechen militia who, took issue with him from his policy in the 1990s? So on and so forth, giving you no time to think about what any of these theories were, yet, not in any way indicating the potential for one of the factions in Russia's state to take one of the factions in Russia's state taking responsibility for it. So I wouldn't say so much it's mind control, it's just being bombarded by bullshit the whole time. And where does this leave the opposition in Russia then? Well, the opposition, most unfortunately, are disparate, they're weak, they're divided. In 2012 there were protests against Vladimir Putin's inauguration as president. His victory in the 2012 elections was met in St. Petersburg and in Moscow with tens of thousands of protesters coming out onto the streets. And of course, this is a generation of people who have not really known anything different than Putin's Russia, who may be wishing for an alternative, who are locked out of those power structures that the state has created, and feel a very large sense of frustration at the lack of democracy, or the way that managed democracy works in Russia. protests in 2012 drew on three main groups, and they were the leftists, you know, the anti-Putin left. They were the Russian nationalists, and they were the kind of liberal opposition in those areas. Now, the more extremist elements of these protests were prosecuted and jailed. For example, Sergei Udaltsov, the leader of the Left Front, was sent to jail for 4.5 years for his role in organising the protests. They have faced, political exile. People such as Alexei Navalny, who I'll come on to next, has been, issued with all sorts of banning orders and house arrests for his part in the protests. And then there is the kind of let's incorporate them into the existing political structures, and this was very much the position of Ksenia Sobchak, who was the one who was being abused on television during the presidential campaign. She was kind of brought into the power structures as a kind of opposition candidate. Opposition candidate. Now, Navalny has a background Navalny, who is the kind of centerpiece of the Russian opposition at this time, has been doing some incredible work, really, in terms of exposing the corruption which lies at the heart of Putin's Russia and the Putin regime. And he's been doing this for a very popular YouTube channel, which has tens of thousands of subscribers and has gained millions of hits in recent months. And he seems like a very logical person because, the level and scale of corruption, not something I've really had time to dwell on here, is absolutely huge. All of those people appointed to positions within the framework of Putin's Russia use their position when they win government contracts to skim off the top. The Panama Papers were actually really good in exposing some of these ideas, some of these practices. And if we're wondering why, the whole of Belgravia and Kensington is awash with Russian oligarchs, and we call them oligarchs, they're actually government officials for the most part who have been using corrupt practices. Now, while Navalny on the one hand has been doing very good work exposing this, we have to be very, very careful about supporting him. He is an ultra-nationalist who has supported the Russian March in Moscow, which is a gathering of Russian nationalists, and he expressed support in the 2013 Moscow race riots, in which Russian skinheads attacked immigrants in a suburban Moscow district. But what he does is that he has opened a space where corruption and the abuses of Russian politics are able to be talked about by a much wider cadre of the left. And of course, in terms of leftist opposition, there is a whole multitude of groups. The Left Front, the Left Bloc, the Russian Socialist Movement, the Revolutionary Workers Party, Socialist Alternative, Communists of Russia, which is not the Communist Party, a different group, splitters, Russian Communist Workers Party, the Rot Front, and so on and so forth. And the numbers from these groups range from a few dozen to a few thousand members. And of course, these are centering much more on local activism struggles regarding issues of ecology, political rights, LGBT rights, freedom of speech, poverty, workers' rights, and so on and so forth. The difficulty is that in most of these demonstrations and most of these protests which are being arranged by these groups, they are continually targeted by the Russian state. For example, the Interior Ministry and telecommunications regulator, Roskomnadzor, actively monitor leftist and other so-called extremist activity. There's a very good article on the Jacobin mag by Sean Gilroy, which exposes this quite well. So I recommend that if you want to get a little bit of reading on it. And they're also riven by splits, particularly around Ukraine. There are those who support Maidan and oppose Putin, and there are those who support Putin and not Maidan, and there are those who reject both. And of course, this has created a huge controversy amongst the Russian left. Arkady Kots of the Russian Socialist movement recently told Novaya Gazeta, as a result of these splits, we are, on the one hand, accused of being friends of Putin for not supporting the progressive Maidan revolution in Ukraine. And on the other hand, we are called Banderites, followers of the right-wing Ukraine nationalist Steven Bandera. It seems to me that we have chosen the only normal position, but very few have accepted it. And of course, this would seem the logical position regarding the leftist movement, to reject both the imperialism which is being pushed forward by the Ukraine and the Ukrainian state, and the imperialism which is being pushed forward by the Russian state as well. So that is what I would say would be the logical position. But of course, you know, in accepting that and in thinking about how we move forward with that, coming back to where we are on the British left and on the position of Russia, I think that it's very, very, we have to be very cautious about this, because while on the one hand, you know, we've got Theresa May's government who are pushing forward all this stuff, you know, regarding the Skripals and, you know, Russian imperialism and action in Syria and so on and so forth. You know, we shouldn't be saying that, oh, we support Theresa May because, you know, she's anti-Putin and we're therefore supporting the Russian working class. No, absolutely not. We need to be working side by side with the Russian working class in order to, you know, move against the imperialism, the establishment which is put forward regarding Syria, regarding the European Union, regarding NATO, regarding a whole other range of international issues which we can work with the Russian working class on. We need to reject the stance of our government effectively in order to, you know, move forwards with, in order to in any way progressively help what's happening in Russia. It does go back a little bit to that often used statement by Tony Cliff, neither Washington nor Moscow, in this case neither the British establishment nor the Russian establishment. But there are little nuances to that, and I hope that, that with this talk I've been able to expose a few of those.
You mentioned solidarity with the working class of Russia. To what extent I assume there's a huge proletariat. To what extent are they organised? Is there a trade union movement?
Excellent question, thank you.
You're next, yeah. And then the one that
Hi, yeah, Chin, SWP. Thank you for that talk. I just had a question. Could you say a bit more about the relationship between Russia and the US today? Because, you know, when you look at the US media, and especially like Fox News, you know, Russia and Putin's regime has become some kind of scapegoat for everything that is like wrong within the US. And I kind of get a feeling, and maybe I could be wrong of this, that, you know, Theresa May's hardline on Russia is kind of like trying to side with like US establishment politics on Russia to you know, get more support for her endeavors to get closer to Donald Trump's regime. And my last question was also in terms of like Russian imperialism. I mean, if you could say a bit more about like why Russia is supporting Syria, Assad's regime at the moment. Thank you.
Oh yeah, just to say, I saw this programme the other night. It was Reggie Yates, you know, he's like a BBC journalist, and he was doing a documentary on nationalism in Russia. It was really, really scary, really terrifying, really, because these people on the damn it, they were proper Nazis, you know, with the same kind of swastika flag and everything. And there was a section where they were actually having a class in learning how to use knives, and then the next section was to like this black guy that had basically attacked, well, he nearly died, you know, by some nationalists, and that's a kind of regular occurrence. I mean, I feared for Reggie Yates himself, really, because even though he had a film crew with him, people were calling him their N-word, saying, go and get your banana, all this kind of stuff. And he met this nationalist guy whose name I can't remember now, and basically when Reggie Yates left, he said, oh, if we don't like this documentary, I'll send a killer to England. And I thought, oh, crikey, they probably actually could really do that. But the scariest thing about it was how young the demonstrators were, and he went to some organisation called SET, I think. I don't know if you've heard of it. It looked like kind of Facebook, really. All these people really young and good looking, and they were using social media. There were these pictures of Putin, like a strong man like Stalin, and they were all so young and going on about traditional Russian values and the motherland and everything. And you talked about the opposition and how many different little organisations they are. I suppose it's yourself and other people. Like, where do you begin in somewhere like Russia? How do you bring all these things together? And then just another little thing, how brave some people are, because I've seen another documentary about LGBT rights, and people actually do have those solo demonstrations, don't they? They go and stand on their own with placard. I can't believe, and they are really intimidated. So just saying how brave those people are, really.
Can I just see indications if who else wants to speak? So after this, there was somebody here, and then.
Yeah, I just thought, the first sort of 20 minutes, I thought maybe I was at a Tory party conference or United Services Institute down the road. There's this horrible person, Putin, and the last few minutes was sort of the opposition, which is a bit nebulous to me. I think it's very dangerous to start saying Navalny is doing wonderful things and then say he's an ultra-nationalist, fascist type, basically backed by the West as sort of the opposition to Putin. So to look, and to Sobchak as well, I mean, there's a new film out about her and her family. Her father was the mayor of St. Petersburg, and Putin was his sort of protege, and she still refers to him in very deferential terms. So I think you have to be very careful about what we mean by the opposition, and is there actually any real working class opposition or party there? Is there an SWP section there? We haven't heard anything about that. So I mean, what is the actual opposition there? And then I think the other point is, in the end, he's throwing this word imperialism. Is Russia an imperialist country? I mean, that's a big question on the left about Russia imperialist, or is it reacting to the United States? Again, you don't say anything about the United States. I mean, is Russia reacting to the United States? I mean, NATO on the borders, the whole thing about the Ukraine. I mean, what do we say about that?
Thank you. Yes. After this gentleman will be the person in yellow. Yeah. And then,
it's a bit of a sort of point come question, which is on something you said about the NGOs and managed democracy and stuff, which is that the Russian state has been pushing around its NGOs in order to bring them into line. And I noticed in the last couple of years, this is something that the British government has done with NGOs over here. They had this rule about the NGOs can't produce a report which criticises, an NGO that's funded by the government can't produce a report that criticises the government, but of course all of the major NGOs receive funding from the government. And so what I wondered was, I guess obviously in the 90s the Russian state was taking its cue from Western examples on how to rebuild their state, and it seems like recently Western states, or at least Britain, has been taking its cue slightly from Russia on how to develop its own management of democracy. So I wondered if there's any other examples, or what you think about the sort of, what you might say, sort of like interaction or dialectical relationship between Russian and British state in terms of how they manage their democracies.
you're next.
Okay, my name is Colin. I live in Paris. I'm a member of a French organisation called Ensemble. I just wanted to tell people who I was. I think the general position, we have to be very clear that we have to be opposed to NATO, to United States aggressive and expansionist policies, and so on. And I think we also have to be very clear about the nature of the Putin regime, that it's an anti-working class regime, and that it pursues foreign policies which are imperialist. Now, maybe a lesser imperialism compared to the United States and the Western power bloc, but it is still a form of imperialism, and it's a capitalist state which takes a peculiar form. And how socialists and people on the left can in any way, shape or form defend this regime is quite frankly beyond me. That's just a general point. I just wanted to, I have a point of information. Now, my information might be slightly out of date, and I do hope that nothing serious has happened since then, but there are many political prisoners inside Russia, and there are in particular two Ukrainians, Oleg Sentsov and Alexander Kolchenko, who are actually detained in what can only be described as a gulag in the north of Russia, who have been on hunger strike for at least 50 days. Now, the latest information I have is a communique from some French members of parliament dated the 29th of June, in which they ask Putin to release these prisoners because they are in grave danger of dying very shortly. I don't know, do you have any information recently on this subject?
Not.
No.
Unfortunately, not more than what you would.
Could you explain the background? Because it's related to the opposition of these two activists to the Russian occupation of Crimea.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just on this question of Russia and imperialism, because it's so important. I know people on the left, near where I live in Newcastle, and I think around the country as well, whose understanding of Russia is not that it is kind of socialist or communist or anything like that, but in some sense, because it's not the United States of America, it can play some kind of role internationally in terms of being more progressive or different, or somehow a sideways look, a slightly different angle on capitalism to the United States. And what that leads you to, according to the discussions I've been having, is a complete misreading of what Russia is doing in terms of the Assad regime in Syria, for example. And the way that they put it is to say the worst thing in the world is American imperialism. American imperialism is trying to dominate the Middle East through Syria. And the only force in the world that can stop that is, you know, however dodgy they might be as a regime, is Russia, the state of Russia, because it's got tanks and aeroplanes and stuff, and we haven't. However good socialists we might be, we can't stop US imperialism. And it's a major issue, I think, and I think it will continue to be a major issue as the turmoil in the Middle East continues. The way I think that we have to look at it is that imperialism isn't just a simple hierarchy with an imperialist country at the top and then kind of like non-imperialist countries below. Imperialism is a grinding together of major powers, even though one might be bigger than the other. It might have more nuclear weapons than the other. That doesn't mean that you support the smaller imperialist power. So I think it's important to identify Russia as imperialism, and it's kind of, you know, grinding up against other forces. The other thing that cuts across this is the way in which we would understand socialism. For us, and I said this in the meeting about China, for us socialism isn't about the balance between private ownership of capital and the state. For a lot of people it is on the left. They say, well, the state is, you know, more progressive or more towards socialism than private capital. For us, the whole question about socialism and progressive movements is the extent to which ordinary working people are in power or not. And so it's a vertical thing to do with power and control. And the example of it, very almost like a little example of it, which we used as an explanation of what was happening in the late 1980s with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. What happened in a car factory, for example, would be in the manager's office is a picture of Lenin, you know, because of the personality cult of Lenin there. The shift that was taking place would mean the factory gets privatised, gets open to private market competition from the West, and the picture of Lenin comes down and a picture of Margaret Thatcher went up. That's all that happened. The class relations remained the same in that factory, or the factory ended up closing down. So getting the relationship between state and imperialism, I think, is very important for us.
My phone's on silent, but I don't know how to stop it now. It's it's on silent. What's it doing? How's it doing? It's because I'm trying to use the time, the 3-minute timer, but I've got it on silent. But that was 3 minutes. After the speaker here, was somebody that indicated there, comrade there.
Yeah, I mean, is it any wonder, in a sense, that Russia is what it is today? I mean, what happened when the Soviet Union fell and the US went in to exploit and you really pushed a sort of rival, if you like, as far back as it could. But I think in today, the US ruling class are divided about where Russia is in terms of their position, because I think with the rise of China, I mean, the Putin section seemed to be of the view that Russia should be an ally to counterbalance the rise of China. And in one sense, Russia also has an interest in that, in the sense that if China expands, it will probably expand from westward into the Soviet Union. And so there seems to be, in imperialist terms, a sort of connection. But of course, the other side of the ruling class are still, if you like, in the old mode of we need to expand against Russia, and there's this kind of fight. And the British ruling class don't know who's going to come out on top in this, and are kind of really confused and don't know how to deal with it. The other thing, the question I want to ask is what role the internet can play in this, and and how we can propagate our ideas inside Russia, and would we have a bit of information about that?
Can I see any other indications?
I want to endorse the point made by the previous comrade there about Russia and imperialism. I think it's really, really important, and it's important in terms of a general analysis of imperialism that I think has been part of very much the tradition of our organisation, our tendency, the last 20 years or so, that are developing an idea of imperialism, of the idea of sub-imperialism, etc. And the other important point about it, in terms of explaining Russia's behaviour, as it were, as an imperialist power, is by definition, often weaker imperialist powers have to use more sort of muscular efforts, if you want, to sort of impose themselves and to be able to project their power than the more economic dominant imperialist powers. You can see this in a number of different examples. Japan in the 1930s, for example, in the Pacific, having to use quite aggressive tactics because it's the weaker imperialist power that wants to project its power in the region. I think that explains or is an insight into Russia's involvement in the Middle East, etc., and also in the wake of the defeat of American imperialism in Iraq, etc., etc. So I think that's important. But I suppose the question I want to ask is more a question about Putin and his power. And I'm aware of this because I don't want to get into the sort of who did what in the Novichok scandal stuff. So I think you can go down a little rabbit hole there. But when you talk about the sort of vertical power and Putin's sort of strengthening, if you want, a core of the central state that he very much did after that period where power was very much decentralised in the Yeltsin period. I suppose what I'm interested in is how successful has that been, and to what extent do there remain independent actors, independent centres of power over whom Putin doesn't have full control, who are able to act in their own interests within sections of the Russian state apparatus, etc., and act as slightly sort of rogue elements. To some extent, when you have a weak state, as you had in Russia after 1990, you get this fragmentation of sort of what they used to call, in the context of the very weak Chinese state at the beginning of the 20th century, sort of warlordism, as it were, different power individuals and structures in different regional areas and different sections of the state able to act semi-independently. And I suppose what I'm interested in, and this is in the context of something, are there people and groups within the Russian state over whom really Putin doesn't have firm control, who can operate semi-independently of the sort of core interests of that core state, really?
Great question, thank you.
Yes.
I just want to ask a question. What is your stance towards Russia's Today media channel?
And comment here.
Yeah, it's just that the thing about the illusions of the left really around Russia as being some kind of counterpoint to the United States, and one of the problems that's actually got some of the left in around the question of Syria and Assad and so on. I think we can see there exactly where that leads, but it doesn't come from nothing in particular. It's very interesting. In 1990, there was at Marxism that year. I had some East German rail workers. It was just after the wall had come down, and they came to stay day, and the local fire brigade, because the rail workers also worked as firefighters, invited us all for a day out. And we went to the FBU headquarters and so on, and they swapped helmets and all that. And the young man who I was with, the General Secretary of the union said to him, "Oh, I'm a really good friend of Harry Tisch." Harry Tisch was kind of like the TUC, head of the East German Tea, part of that whole kind of Russian bureaucracy close to the state. And he said we're great friends. The person that I was with didn't speak English, and there was an absolute tirade of abuse about what a shithead he was and how he stole from the workers and all the rest of it. And the translator said, "Not all the workers see eye to eye with the." So, I mean, I think what you've got is you've got a legacy of the old kind of Stalinist left that still had illusions that somehow Russia was in some way a worker state. You have also people like this young man who saw sort of the Eastern Bloc in some ways looking forward to the time when he could get dollars and European money, but at the same time very worried about what was going to happen to the cost of fuel for his house and whether they'd lose their housing and so on. So there's an enormous amount of tension that blew up there, that actually what has happened, a combination of factors that came together. I'm sure you spoke, I was a bit late, so you spoke about how that was pulled back and these vertical structures in place. But when people talk about where the power lies, I actually think we have to go back to our basic politics. You look at Russia, it's not a complete basket case yet, although that may well end up in that situation. There is still a massive working class there. The question is, how do we orientate around it? And I'd be really interested to find out how that can happen, because what happened in the 90s, most of the speakers that came from the Eastern Bloc to talk at Marxism then were very much from, the universities, the intelligentsia, that kind of thing. And there was an attempt to try and make that contact. But actually what you've got is this contradictory consciousness going on in the class where they want a better life. They want to not have to buy crap jeans and, be part of a world that looks great on the internet. But on the other hand, they have expectations. It's just like the working class does here, that you have a roof over your head, you're not dying from illnesses and so on. And it's a question of finding a space in which that battle can take place. Now, the right is obviously building in that. And we have to look for any opportunities, and I think one of the key things for us is that we start to do kind of activities around what's happening, the questions of, the stop the war, not stop the war movement itself, but certainly the question of what's happening in the Middle East. All of these arguments are coming out around that as well, that we need to be taking forward. And there is now quite an interchange of people going backwards and forwards. One of my colleagues at work is going to work in Moscow next year and so on, and we do need to be thinking about how we can get something in the interstices of society there on the left that engage in those debates. And I'd really be interested to ask you what you know about what's actually possible in those circumstances, because obviously it's very different than trying to organise something here and the difficulties of it. And I'd like to know if you've got any examples of where people can actually bypass this kind of rigid directional structure where everyone's kept under the cosh of both a combination of corruption and force that's trying to keep them in line. I'm quite sure that given the size of the working class and unless you have them all in the military, there must be potential.
Thanks, Rob.
How long have I got? 10 minutes? Okay, brilliant, because there's lots of questions. Thank you. Thank you all for putting forward some really, really valuable questions, I think. So let me try and deal with some of these. So, starting with the position on Navalny, and let me temper my words slightly. I think that it's a good thing that, for example, somebody like, I've got a 13-year-old niece in Russia who has engaged in politics for the first time by looking at the videos which Navalny has been making, which expose the corruption at the heart of the Russian state. I think that's a good thing, but that can't be our default position. We can't say, because Navalny talks about corruption, we need to therefore support him. No, what he does is he opens up a space which can be exploited greater by the left, because he generates a discussion about about corruption. We need to reject his neoliberal stance regarding economic issues and his ultra-nationalist stance on social issues and political issues, most certainly so. But let's say it's a welcome development to that extent. That doesn't mean we should support Navalny. We should be very cautious about our position on him. To what extent is the Russian proletariat organised? You're right. Yeah, comrades who have put forward these questions, absolutely right. There's a massive, huge constituency out there which the left can potentially tap into, and of course, what we've got is there, you know, so to what extent are they all organised? It's very, very difficult to organise in Russia because of the laws, anti-protest laws and the internet restrictions which I was talking about. That doesn't mean that organisation doesn't happen. A few years ago I was in Kazan, which is about a day east from Moscow, and I was talking with some comrades who were setting up a kind of workers' collective. They were looking at how to kind of propagate leftist socialist ideas in the big industrial plants in Kazan. I showed them the Socialist Worker website, and they were absolutely blown away. They were like, "Wow, how do you have, you know, this, you know, very high standard, you know, lots of articles about different things, etc., etc." And they said, "Well, how many people have you got working on this?" And I assumed that, you know, we've got a few dozen people working, and they were like, "A few dozen? Wow! Like, look at the people in this room," and we numbered about 9. So, you know, the thing is that it's very resource poor. Unfortunately, there are some very, you know, dedicated people and very dedicated comrades who are working towards, you know, helping organise the Russian working class. But it's very difficult conditions and very resource poor in terms of how they're able to move forward to do that. The key question here is going to be what happens in 2024, because that's when Putin's constitutional mandate runs out officially, unless they change the constitution again. Who knows? They've done it before. But the thing is that the regime is very apprehensive about the potential opening up for opposition within this. If anybody saw the Kemerovo fire in Siberia earlier this year, where I think it's 65 people, mostly children, were killed in a shopping centre fire after they'd been locked into the cinema in there. And you could see the panic from the Russian state already seeping in. Putin flew immediately over there. There were protests which were being organised against it, and there was very much a sense that we want to try and keep a lid on things as much as possible. The danger also regarding, you know, looking to the future is the growth of the far right in Russia. They do have, you know, strong forces, and there are a whole plethora of far right organisations out there who Putin has taken a very dubious gamble on, because in the early years of his reign, as he was appealing to the base of Russian nationalism, he actually let, you know, more space for these groups to organise and develop. And now, of course, you know, by you know, letting ethnic nationalism out of the box, ethnic nationalism, a very, very dangerous, unstable force. You know, again, part of the fear of the Russian state is that this might, you know, kind of flow into some. This is another area which needs to be, you know, quietly curtailed and quite tightly controlled. So it's one of those situations, you know, maybe looking back into Russian history, the number of forces which exist within Russia are so many that it's kind of difficult to keep a lid on all of them. And the further that you try and centralise things, the more potential for things spinning out of control might grow. We can only see this, you know, through time. In terms of organising with the Russian working class, I think that, yeah, our positions on Ukraine have been, you know, particularly helpful. Stop the War is potentially, you know, a very good vehicle for continuing and maintaining that alliance. how do we do it? I suppose one thing maybe we need to talk about as a party, as a collective, is that how we might, bring ourselves more in line with some of the organisations that exist in Russia. What else? Regarding the power structure in Russia, is anybody able to curtail it? And what are the implications of that? Yes, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, but I had to skip, was the existence of clans around Putin. There are various clans, the Siloviki clan, who are his power base within the security organisations, the St. Petersburg Lawyers Group. This is people like Dmitry Medvedev, who have been providing a lot of the basis for administrative reform, and the oligarchs themselves. There is lots of factional infighting between these different clans. In the run-up to the 2018 presidential election, there was a former finance minister, Vladimir Yevtushenkov, who was Yevtushenkov was the oligarch who got Yevtushenkov was the oligarch who had his assets taken from him. In the run-up to the former finance minister, and it's literally just escaped me, I can check it, but was arrested on corruption charges. He had been set up basically by a member of the Siloviki, by a guy called Igor Sechin, who is a very powerful and fearsome presence within the Kremlin, who's a personal advisor to Putin. Now, it was clear that what was happening here is that Sechin was trying to bump one of his rivals out of the way as a jockeying for position started to line up within the Kremlin power structures as to the new administration. Is that potentially, what happened with the Skripals? It may well be. Is that what happened with Nemtsov? It was very instructive way back in 2006 when Anna Politkovskaya, the investigative journalist, was murdered on Putin's birthday. So what I'm saying is that there are forces that exist within the Russian state that, yes, can use their power independently because they have that close relationship to the power structures in the Kremlin. How long have I got left?
Another 5 minutes, please.
Okay, so moving on, I just want to say a few words as well about imperialism, because a lot of questions came up regarding Russia and imperialism. And I think that if we're looking at Russia's stance in the international world, we need to go back to 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, where Putin was invited as a special guest, and he made a speech about, where he declared that the unipolar world of the United States was very much over, and what he saw coming forward was a multipolar world where countries had greater influence within particular regions. Of course, with this mindset, and this is what's been happening in Russia. If you look at the imperialism which Russia has gone on with in 2008, the annexation of Abkhazia, the northern Georgian states, into the Russian state. They call it an autonomous territory, that you need a Russian passport to get. You need a passport to cross the border to get out of Georgia and into there. The situation regarding Ukraine, when Russia was unable to fulfill its dream of a customs union between Ukraine, Kazakhstan and Russia, there was a retaliation, a snapback, if you like, of the Russian state taking an active role, A, in the annexation of Crimea, and B, the what has turned into now a frozen conflict, but the conflict in the eastern regions of Ukraine. So Russia has been acting, as it were, as a regional power within its own backyard. And regarding the situation with Trump, that is a situation which, a development which Russia has seemingly been quite pleased about, because Trump seems to fall into that exact same mode of thinking with, increasing, the tariffs, for example, the potential of starting a trade war, saying NATO's not so important as it used to be, and things like that, actually fits in with Putin's worldview and the world order that perhaps Putin would like to see. What else? Russia today. I don't have a favourable view of Russia today. While they support an alternative media viewpoint regarding politics out here in the West, it's a viewpoint which is informed very much by Kremlin politics, and therefore one which I would take with scepticism, to say the least. I'd agree with the comrade from France regarding the position on imperialism. Russia is very much an imperialist power who is looking to exercise and increase its power within the regions surrounding Russia, and also why Syria. There's lots of Russian vested interest in Syria. They have a Mediterranean seaport in the Mediterranean coast of Syria as a result of that. And there are several oil pipelines which have strategic importance for the Russian state as well. As a result of this, Putin has been supporting Assad and supporting Assad, trying to further Russian state interest, to maintain Russian state interests there. What's the position on Ukrainian political prisoners? Unfortunately, I think you might well be more informed and better informed about this situation yourself. But what has happened since the Ukrainian war took place is there has been, a huge kind of crackdown on voices within Russia, who are opposing Russian action in this area of the world, but B, a crackdown on activists within Russia who are also trying to organise, who are trying to organise around this kind of anti-war banner, and of course, what we have the situation that people are being jailed as a result of their activities. I'll finish up because somebody asked a question about the internet. The internet, I think, is perhaps the greatest resource that the Russian working class have at their disposal in terms of organising. Although there are restrictions on it, a whole number of websites have been able to build up in recent years, and especially quite good use of VKontakte, the Russian version of Facebook, as well, has also been key. It was key in organising the 2012 protests, and it's such a large space that it's almost impossible to get complete reign over it. So there's potential there looking forward, but Russia being Russia, we can't necessarily, and the world being what it is at this moment in time, we can't necessarily, predict what's going to happen, but we can, I think, look towards making links and building bridges with comrades over there regarding that. Yeah, thanks.